Hi. Thanks for the correction on the quiz there. I fixed that. I believe it is correct to say it prevents the creation of unnecessary feature caches. I think that's the primary benefit of collapsing that bookmark, because then you have fewer feature caches. As I mentioned, this is really, as far as I see it, only helpful when you're authoring. I don't think it really helps very much when you're running the workspace. The point was made that it does reduce a bit of the graphical user interface load on the workspace if you're running in Workbench even with caching off. I'd be surprised if that made any difference in this workspace specifically, but yeah, maybe in a bigger workspace with a very large bookmark, it might have an impact. I'm not actually sure. I'll make a note about that. And I've asked our developers about the Workbench versus Workspace runner question about performance, because I'm actually not, and batch file, I'm not actually sure. I could see an argument that not having Workbench open, which is a graphically sort of intensive piece of software, maybe might help if you didn't have it open, but I'm not sure. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so if you had 2,000 transformers, then yeah, it probably would matter to collapse. So that's a good point. We should probably specify that in big workspaces. Okay, let's go to the next one. Happy to take any questions as they come up, but I'm going to keep going. And we'll talk about separating authoring and production, which is kind of related to a little bit of what we've been talking about already. How is collapsing the bookmark different from custom transformer? Well, it's different in a few ways. I guess basically collapsing a transformer is just a simpler method of not generating caches. Well, in fact, actually, custom transformers can generate caches in them as well. So it is actually a bit different that way, that it doesn't generate caches in a collapsed bookmark. And of course, custom transformers have all the additional functionality that we went over yesterday. I think that's the main difference. When you're building a workspace in FME, you are authoring. That's when you're in there, adding transformers, configuring them, connecting things up. And as you go through that process, you're probably doing some kind of iterative and incremental development. You're adding one thing, you're testing it. If it works, you're moving on to the next thing. And you should be testing basically every single change you make to make sure the change was correct. It's usually faster to do that than to make a bunch of big changes and then try to figure out what went wrong if there's a problem. We talk more about that in our FME Form Basic course in terms of prototyping. But in addition to thinking about incremental development when you're authoring, it's also important to think about the differences in what you want to benefit from in performance when you're authoring versus performance in production, so to speak. So when a workspace is finished and it's just going to run when you actually need it to do its job. It's helpful to think of those as separate stages. And I would say in general, a lot of our users aren't quite there, but in general, I think a lot of our more advanced users and customers are moving towards basically a CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous development approach, or deployment, approach to using FME. So they have like development, test, and production environments. They will test their workspaces in the test environment that before deploying them to production where they'll be in use. And we're building a more features into our platform. Like recently, we added deployment parameters to FME Flow. That was a big one. We're building more tools to essentially let you build a CI/CD pipeline with FME, which follows, more broadly software development best practices. So what are some ways you can think about separating authoring and production? Well, one is the idea of logging and inspecting. Logging and inspecting are going to be mostly useful during authoring. There's good arguments to use loggers, I think, for your actual log in production, so you can go and see what went wrong if something did go wrong. But more often, I think people are using inspectors, loggers, and feature caches during the authoring stage. And they can be helpful for identifying problems and issues and fixing them, but they do, of course, add some overhead in terms of performance. So if you don't need them in production, it's a good idea to remove them. I would say a lot of people don't really use the inspector transformers anymore or inspector transformer anymore because we have feature caching now. But loggers, I think, are still used pretty commonly. One thing you should do if you don't think you need the loggers in production or the inspectors if you're using them, there is a tool under the tools menu in Workbench. There's tools remove, and then you have 3 options there. Unattached, which can automatically remove any object on the canvas which isn't attached to another object. That can be handy, particularly in that case of feature types earlier. If you have a bunch of excess feature types, that can be a quick way to get rid of them. You can also remove all inspectors, and you can remove all loggers. So this can be handy if you're only using those during authoring and then you feel like you're done. You can clean up by using that remove step. Now, of course, probably the biggest difference between authoring and production is whether you have feature caching on or not. We recommend having feature caching on during authoring and turning it off when you're running a workspace in Workbench in production. Keep in mind, of course, that if you're running a workspace anywhere else, so batch, file, command line, FME flow, workspace runner, all of those cases, feature caching won't be used. So you don't have to worry about it in those scenarios. You really just have to worry about it if you're running a workspace in production in Workbench. Good idea to turn it off. And similarly, same idea, inspectors don't slow things down if you did it on Flow, for example. So you don't really need to worry about the inspectors if you're not running it in Workbench, but if you are running a workspace in Workbench in production, you should remove those inspectors. Another idea here would be disabling sections of your workspace. You can right-click objects and connections on your canvas and choose disable to turn them off. They won't run, and anything downstream of them won't run. And so you might have sections of your workspace you're testing, or I sometimes, particularly with web workflows, sometimes I build a separate test process basically so that it doesn't have to, maybe clog up an API or actually send data somewhere it doesn't belong. And so I'll sometimes build a whole section which is testing something, and I'll either disable it, or another option you can use as well is to use a user parameter to control if something runs or not. That's kind of my preferred thing when building a test workflow for web processes. So for example, recently I built a workspace which reports back on our attendance for live courses into our Slack instance messaging app. It just posts, how many people came, what the class was, and that kind of thing. And when I was building that, I didn't want to send a bunch of messages to our actual Slack. So I put in a test yes or no user parameter. When test was equal to yes, it would send it to a private channel that only I could see for testing. And then if testing was no, which is what I set it to when I put it in production, then it actually sends it to the correct Slack channel. And that, of course, only will run, I can use that user parameter to run certain parts of the workspace using testers. And so that's another kind of way to handle a difference there. The deployment parameter idea with FME Flow, where basically the workspace will be aware of which instance of Flow you're running it on. That can be another way to do something like that. Let's see, another question here. Does disabling inspectors and leaving in the workspace negatively impact performance? Is it better to disable connections before inspectors? So yeah, if the inspector is disabled or the connection to the inspector is disabled, those both will improve performance. You can do it either way. You just don't want them to run. That would be the only thing that would affect your performance when running in Workbench. Okay, go ahead and work on the quiz for that section. I'll give you 5 minutes to do that, and then we'll continue. Thanks. Great question so far.